Tonight on Let It Rip.
I made a commitment to the American people that I would end this war. Today, I've honored that commitment.
But it was far from mission accomplished, as hundreds of Americans are left behind, along with billions of dollars in U.S. military equipment and weapons. Tonight, some Republicans are demanding answers and even talking about impeachment.
President Biden lied to the American people. He said he would get everybody out, and he didn't.
Time to Let It Rip. On the panel tonight, he's the former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands and a former congressman from Michigan who served as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Pete Hoekstra is beaming in, as is the founder and publisher of the oldest running Arab American newspaper in the nation. Osama Sablani is back, along with Professor Saeed Khan, an expert on Asian and Near East studies at Wayne State University. Also with us, not so much as the Oakland County Republican chair, but as retired Lieutenant Colonel, a man who actually served in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom, Andrew Rocky Pachkowski. Plus, award-winning reporter, commentator, talk show host with Deadline Detroit, Craig Foley is here. And as always, anchor attorney Charlie Langton. But we begin tonight with a surprise guest, a U.S. serviceman who just recently served in Afghanistan, helping to maintain the aircraft used in the war. Now, we've agreed not to use his real name or rank. We're going to call him Sergeant Smith. He's on the phone with us right now. Sergeant Smith, thank you so much. You know, there's a lot of concern right now. Sergeant Smith, there's a lot of concern right now that some of the billions of dollars in equipment that we left behind could be used against us later. What can you tell us about that situation?
Well, when I served my time over there in Afghanistan, I was there at Kabul, and the equipment that they have, first of all, is downgraded equipment. It's not to the specs that we have our equipment here. And most of the equipment, when I left there, was pretty much not mission capable. I would say they might have had maybe a fourth of the inventory even capable of doing anything with. And so most times, yes, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, you disabled as much and as many of those aircraft as you could before and during the evacuation.
Yes, definitely. Pulling avionics, destroying as much as possible, just so it wouldn't be in the hands of the wrong people.
A lot of us, Sergeant Smith, were surprised, though, at how quickly the Afghan army fell apart. You trained some of these guys. What do you think happened?
I can honestly tell you, I saw this coming a mile away. This was something that it just seemed you was going to have to rip the Band-Aid off on this one, because we were holding their hand a lot on everything that was going on over there. We had contractors in place, we had military in place that was pretty much over the shoulder at all times, or most of it, I would say when there was missions that needed to happen, we were accomplishing them. We were doing them. We were pushing them out and making sure that it gets done. And so you got most of these guys who wasn't educated, that was the Afghanis, couldn't read English. We have American aircraft there. Everything's in English. Things wasn't translated for them into Pashto or to Dari, so they couldn't read some of that stuff. So it was hard. Their motivation is nothing like ours in America. Our day in the day, we're ready to go. We're ready to fight for our country. We're motivated. And with these guys, it was just, inshallah, as they call it. If God willing, whenever they're ready, they'll get up and they'll get it done. So that made, yes.
I also understand that some of them had ongoing drug problems.
Yes, there's definitely a drug problem there. You can say drugs and liquor. There was no kind of, I guess you could say, any kind of regulations or rules in place for their military or anything, unlike ours. We have a lot of things we can't be alleviated when we come into work. We have standards and things like that. Yes, these guys can come in as any way they had. I mean, the main problem was they didn't have everybody wanted to fight, so they took whoever they could, whoever was willing to get there and take a paycheck and come out there and try to do some maintenance.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long, Sergeant Smith, because I don't want your identity to be revealed, but would you say that what we saw happen was inevitable, no matter when we left?
Definitely. It wouldn't have mattered if we waited another 10 years or if we did it 10 years earlier, the same issue would have happened. I hate that what happened the way it did, but it had to happen. We needed to get our guys back home And it's just sad to see that we were more motivated to take care of their country than they were, and that hurt. So none of our guys' lives are gone in vain. We did what we did. We got our main target when it all came down to it, getting bin Laden. That was the most important part to all this.
Well, Sergeant Smith, we're glad that you made it back, and we thank you for your service, as well as the service of all those with whom you served. Thank you.
It's an honor.
And it's an honor to talk to you tonight. Thank you. All right, panel, you've heard from somebody who was actually in the middle of it all. Pete, let me begin with you, because you spent more than a decade on the House Intelligence Committee. You served as chairman for 3 years. What didn't you know then that we know now? There doesn't seem to be a connection between what we thought we were fighting and how this ended.
Well, there's not a whole lot more that we know today than what we knew 10 years ago. We always knew that this would be a very, very tough struggle. We always knew that, Afghanistan has really never been a country. It was Kabul, and then you had all the different provinces and those types of things. You had a tribal culture that we tried to bring into, a nation state, a democracy. We always knew it was difficult. There were always differences of opinion in terms of how far we should push this government in terms of styling a Western style democracy. And, there were decisions made over those, 18, 20 years that were there that obviously over that length of time, most of those decisions were wrong. Otherwise, we would not have seen the collapse of that we saw in the last 2 weeks.
And look, I think both Democrats and Republicans thought indeed if we stayed long enough, we could affect some sort of change in the society, but it just didn't happen.
I mean, there was change. Obviously, there was progress for women's rights and education and all of those types of things. The question isn't whether there was change while we were there. I think, as you're implying, the question is whether it was sustainable without us. I think the real question that we may face and have to face is what would have been a minimal footprint to maintain the progress and the security and keeping the radical elements in check. Could it have been 2,500 people, special ops and those types of things? Or was it, if you really wanted to do it, it was going to have to be 10, 20, 25,000 people. The American people would have looked at that two very, very different ways.
I don't think that option was ever really presented to the American people, though, because the scope of the mission was never really, really clear to any of us here as to exactly what it was we were trying to accomplish. Were we trying to eliminate al-Qaeda, or were we trying to create a new democracy there? That mission creep that occurred over these 20 years, I think, made people sort of tune it out, which is what's led to this sort of, inevitable collapse of our mission there, as ugly as it has been.
Well, that's why you're with us tonight. I think that's an excellent insight. There was mission creep, and there was never really a clarity of what that mission should be. Nation building, we have found we're not very good at. It's very, very difficult. We can always talk about the successes we have after World War II, but after that and going into this type of a culture we found out is almost impossible.
Well, I have to step aside for a second and disagree a little bit from the perspective of what Craig mentioned about that we didn't know or we weren't never consulted. The American people aren't consulted by the commander in chief. Most importantly, we always had a statement, and it was always printed before you left the gates. It was, while you are at war, America's at the mall. Most people in America don't understand what it takes to be a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marines. When 1% of your population is fighting a war or is participating in the active defense of over 330 million people in this country, and most people don't understand what it feels like to put on a uniform or put their life on the line. So, Craig, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to correct you and say I think it's the fault of our education system and our society as a whole that may thank soldiers as a whole and sailors, airmen, and Marines for their service, but doesn't understand what it really means to serve.
Osama, let me bring Osama in. Let me bring Osama in.
There is no doubt that we have a great army and we appreciate their services. The problem in here is the political decision that takes armies to places where they should not be. This is the problem. The problem is not Democrat, is not Republican, it's Democrat and Republican. It's just we wanted to be the policeman of the world. And frankly, we have been failing everywhere we've gone, from Vietnam to Somalia, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Syria, to Yemen, to wherever we go. We do not know how to build nations. We know how to destroy nations.
We're not in the nation building process, Osama. And quite frankly, I disagree with you on Somalia.
One more thing.
Osama, hold on one second. On Somalia,
we do not want a general in here to tell us, or a colonel that to tell us that how great our army is and how much we appreciate them. We do appreciate them. What we do not appreciate is taking the army and the Navy and the Marines and our good guys and girls and throw them in the fire without a good purpose.
Let me just first tell you, Operation Enduring Freedom. Hold on one second, Osama. Hold on one second. Osama. Hold on one second. Let's not talk over each other.
When President Reagan called those people who we are calling right now terrorists, he called them mujahideen, that they were freedom fighters. That's Ronald Reagan, the President Ronald Reagan.
Again, Osama, please, let's not talk over. Let's not talk over each other.
Okay, we don't.
We're not here for a history lesson either. Remember, the Mujahideen also supported us, and the Northern Alliance supported us when we first went into Afghanistan. And the reason we went into Afghanistan and Operation Enduring Freedom stood up was to capture Osama bin Laden. Let's not forget that. It took us till 2011. Hold on one second, Osama.
All right,
it took us to 2011 because of political decisions.
Okay, look, we don't need a history lesson here. We want to talk about Afghanistan and the recent events, if possible. Professor Saeed Khan, the Taliban that we see today is not the same Taliban that we started fighting 20 years ago. When you look at the situation now, do you believe it is possible to forge some sort of agreement with our former enemies to advance the interests of America and Afghanistan at the same time?
Well, that's already been underway. After all, last year, the Trump administration was negotiating with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, which of course is somewhat ironic because it's still listed as a terrorist organization, which means the United States actually committed a criminal act by giving and lending material support to a terrorist organization. But we also have the the Biden administration, which is negotiating still. And in fact, the Taliban's cooperation helped to escort Americans and others to the tarmac at Kabul airport. So that is going on as we speak. But we also have to realize that it's not just the Taliban that has changed in the last 20 years. The geopolitics has changed. Back in the 1990s, when the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, there were only 3 countries that recognized it formally: Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Right now, we have waiting in the wings 2 superpowers, China and Russia, that are willing to go ahead and recognize the Taliban regime. China and the Taliban have been negotiating at very high levels, including their foreign minister as recently as even a month ago. So that train has already left the station. It's just a matter of whether now the United States wants to buy a ticket on it.
And keep this in mind, too. I mean, look, one of the things the Taliban has to keep in mind is that there are a ton of resources that the Afghan government had, which are in control. The United States is in control of a whole bunch of the money that they need if they actually want to try to govern this country. The Federal Reserve has their hands on billions and billions of dollars that they need, frankly. So they have no choice but to negotiate in some way with the United States, because otherwise they're in deep trouble. They've got big problems on their own home front.
But here's the problem.
Unless somebody picks up the shortfall of that money, Craig, if China and Russia will go ahead and give money, then the American input in it is really inconsequential. And one point that Ambassador Hoekstra made, if I can provide a corrective, Afghanistan was always a country. It's just that you never respected its sovereignty. And when you have a country like China that is respecting its sovereignty, then you're going to find that the rules of engagement are going to change dramatically, and probably not the way that the United States would like it to.
No, but it seems to me that what the American public doesn't understand, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I understand we spent about $83 billion in the war in Afghanistan. That is a lot of money. And I think that the public is going to ask, what did we get for that?
$2 trillion.
The
number is higher. It's actually
higher. Then it's higher.
6.4 trillion in
out of there. We lost
Afghanistan
the
and Iraq.
equipment. There's so many things that we did not get. And I think that is an issue. Can you imagine if we spent billions of dollars in our own country? And I think the president now is going to have to at least justify how much we spent. And everyone's going to have to justify that. Otherwise,
should that expense lead to the impeachment of President Joe Biden? There's some Republicans who are calling for that right now. All right, panel, we appreciate your comments. More to come as Let It Rip continues. Welcome back to Let It Rip. The question before us right now is what to do about Afghanistan. What is the way forward now that U.S. troops have left and now that hundreds of Americans are still left behind? We're going to turn now to Pete Hoekstra with a comment made earlier about the American view of Afghanistan. Pete.
I think the comment that I was making just was a reference to Afghanistan, that Kabul has never been in control of the entire country. There are tribal groups there. There are other organizations. Kabul has never centralized the authority. As to where we go next, obviously our focus has to be on the Americans that are still there, our friends and allies who are still there. I know that there are still Dutch nationals in country, the Afghans that work with us. We need to get them out and make sure that they are safe and secure. Monitor Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not the biggest threat that we face in the world today. We can't lose sight of the other challenges that we face, especially places like China.
Should we take some consolation in the fact that this group that we labeled as a terrorist organization is not doing what ISIS did in Iraq? They're not capturing Americans and beheading them. They are, in fact, in some cases, actually protecting the Americans who are there. Does that indicate to you at least some degree of cooperation between these former enemies?
Yeah, I think that's a story we're waiting to see written. Let's talk about that in 2 or 3 months, and when all the Americans and others are out of the country.
Where are you getting this report about Americans being protected and defended by the Taliban? We currently have a hostage right now that was taken December 2020, Mark Frerichs, and quite frankly, I don't agree with the precept or the belief that the Taliban is protecting Americans or even protecting them right now. One of the things that Craig actually mentioned earlier and Saeed agreed with was the negotiations, the fact that we have frozen their cash supply, their international cash supply, and their big trump card, so to speak, is the fact that there still are Americans in theater.
I think the right decision has been made to pull out of Afghanistan. And I think the best decision that we make right now moving forward is not to go anywhere else, make the same mess that we made in Afghanistan. And the second best thing, in my opinion, and you continue to laugh as much as you want, but let me tell you, this country needs leadership to do the right thing inside America.
It had leadership.
We are a nation that's crumbling. The infrastructure is bad. We are divided. We have social issues. We have political issues. We have economical issues. So we do not want to go and destroy other nation. Let's build our nation if we can.
Osama, I will agree with you on that. And that's why President Trump, if you recall, President Trump did want to leave Afghanistan. And by the way, Saeed, was something you mentioned earlier about negotiating with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar. The fact is, it wasn't a negotiation per se. There were conditions. We were not to give up Bagram Air Force Base. He had a military exit plan. Never does the military leave before your assets leave. So if Biden would have followed the Trump administration blueprint and the agreements, we probably wouldn't have had the exit that we had the last 2 weeks.
This mess is the combination of Democrat and Republican. We cannot forget that the person who invaded Afghanistan is President George W. Bush.
For what reason?
And then continuing the mistakes and carried by former president, whether they were Republican and Democrat. Now we have made the right decision to pull out of Afghanistan. We should pull out of Iraq, and we should look at our own country in here and build our nation, because we are in a terrible position.
We also need to secure our border and make sure that we protect our nation.
This is the real issue. It's not getting out of Afghanistan. I think everybody, Republican, Democrat, Trump and Biden agreed that we should be out of Afghanistan. The issue is, how do we do that? And what did we leave behind? What really did we get for our money? Is this a government now? If it is going to be the Taliban, I'm not convinced it's going to be. But if it is, can we deal with this group? Do we trust the people that we trained for all of these years and spent all these billions of dollars? And I think the jury is still out on that issue.
Charlie, the people that we trained are not. I think
the jury is in, Charlie. I think the jury is in. And I think that this, as Rocky was alluding to, is one of the real tragedies, that we put a lot of stock into the Afghan National Army, which proved its incompetence. And we also put our faith in a civilian government, which, and I think this is the point that you made, Rocky, is very important. These were elites of Afghanistan who clearly did not have they weren't representing the people of Afghanistan. They represented a very, very small bandwidth. And it is one of the recurring mistakes that we make as Americans, is putting our faith in a very small and non-representative form of populations when we go into countries, whether it was in Iraq with Ahmed Chalabi and his group of crooks, or if it is in Afghanistan as well. There's lessons to be learned for future engagement, and I'm not sure if we're really there yet as a nation to be doing that right now.
And Saeed, to add on to that, we actually have a military doctrine. It's called FID, Foreign Internal Defense, on how we train the military and help the government work with the military to exercise their military power. The problem here is when you've got, and adding on to what Saeed said, corrupt individuals in their government taking the money, not paying their soldiers, selling equipment, and like we heard earlier from this Sergeant Smith, individuals that are illiterate and being trained over and over and over again, you've got a problem.
And can I just say one thing, alluding to what Rocky said, that we had different leadership before when we started talking with the Taliban in the first place. You won't find me saying a lot of great things about Donald Trump, but the one thing that I will credit him for is recognizing that the Taliban was the only credible organization to be dealing with at this point. They recognized that this government was going to collapse. The military was likely going to collapse. Trump actually got that right. And we are stuck with the Taliban, so we better make the best of it.
Actually, Craig, the reason that why President Trump and the administration negotiated with Secretary Pompeo and the DOD involved with the Taliban was not because we believed that the government would fall. It was because they were the ones that were fighting the government and fighting U.S. forces.
And yet,
Trump they knew who was going to win
the government to those negotiations. But, you know, when you look at the numbers, people, when you think of all the money we spent, when you look at the numbers of people who died, of U.S. servicemen who lost their lives, we grieve along with their families. But 2,400 American servicemen and women died in that long 20-year war. We lost 58,000 in Vietnam, 54,000 in Korea. We lost 500,000 in World War II. We lost 600,000 in the Civil War. So when you look at the lives lost, it is sad, but in some ways, that number doesn't tell you really the entire cost, or really who won or lost.
It tells our cost. It doesn't tell the entire cost, because ask the Afghan civilians, they were by far the highest number of casualties in this war. People had nothing to do with any of this who died as a result. Look at the number of people who are contract workers that died, more than American soldiers, 20,000 soldiers wounded, U.S. soldiers. How many Afghan soldiers died? This is something that has been, you know, you look at it only in the numbers of American soldiers who died, then people can justify staying there forever. But it's just something we need to look beyond that prism.
66,823 Afghanis.
One soldier died. If one soldier is dead, the result is embarrassing, is catastrophic. I mean, what we have done in the last 20 years, it doesn't matter how many people have been dead. If it was one, it was too much for what we have gotten as a result. It's a disaster. It doesn't matter how you measure it, up and down, Democrat or Republican, in military sense and political sense, it's all total loss. Total loss.
The interesting thing and
maybe bottom line, we have to find another way on some occasions to win battles without going to war.
Correct.
Maybe we're there. Hopefully.
Agreed.
All right, panel, we thank you for the comments. We're out of time. We could talk about this for another hour, but For this session of Let It Rip, we're done. We'll be back hopefully with some final thoughts. Thank you. Thanks for watching this special edition of Let It Rip.